Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back after our break. Before I say anything else, I'll just say this share has been sponsored L'Iloi Nishmas Zvera Basya Bas Shalom Michal, and Mitzvah Hashem, the Torah we learn should be a Iloi Neshama for her and a source of nechama and comfort for her family. So we're in the middle of Makkeh BePatish. I apologize in advance. I think this share will be a little bit bitty, with just a few sort of bits and pieces there, partly because it's taken me a little bit of time to get back into the sugya after the break, and therefore I just wanted to use now for some chazara, and there were also a few pieces left over that we sort of didn't quite finish off last time that probably are connected to what we were talking about. The main points I want to highlight in terms of chazara is the number one, the shitta of the Rambam. I think we came to the conclusion in the Rambam that the Rambam understood that Makkeh BePatish is not primarily Gemara Melacha. Gemara Melacha is an example of Makkeh BePatish, but Makkeh BePatish is the actualization of any particularly choshev or significant asiyah in the object, of which Gemara Melacha is one sort, but Hu Hadin, similarly, Maiseumen, for example, which is actualized or expressed in an object, would also qualify as Makkeh BePatish. That was the one point I want to highlight. The second point I wanted to highlight was the view of the Meiri and the slightly differing view of the Aruch HaShulchan. They both are somewhat along similar lines, albeit with slight differences. The Meiri says something is only nechshav as Makkeh BePatish if the object is fundamentally already completed, and what I'm doing is now acting on a complete object to improve it or perfect it or to remove barriers to it. So the Ezen is fundamentally already hewed from the mountain, but now I need to throw it off. Or the object is already complete, I now just need to cut some threads and remove them. But if I'm still making the object, then that's not Makkeh BePatish. Makkeh BePatish is only when there's a chashivus that it's already a complete object. The intuition around the Meiri here, the actual svar of the Meiri I struggle with a little bit, because it does seem to be a little bit of a kal v'chomer. I mean, if something is choshev because it's completed and I'm just tidying it up, then kal v'chomer, surely if I'm making something and actually completing it, why wouldn't that be the malacha? Nonetheless, the Meiri says the definition of Makkeh BePatish is because it is already complete. I'm acting in a completed object and I'm just removing problems or perfecting it rather than actually making the object. The Aruch HaShulchan says, as far as that's a little easier for me to understand, the Aruch HaShulchan says that Makkeh BePatish is when there's a specific act of completing different to all the acts that occurred or that I did previously to it. If I just repeat and repeat and repeat a manufacturing act till I've done enough of them and now the object is complete, then the action I'm doing is not Makkeh BePatish because I've done it already 50 times beforehand. That's just the process of manufacturing. So if it's a malacha, it's a malacha. If it's not a malacha, it's not a malacha. If there's a specific completing act, which is the completion act different to the acts that preceded it, then that's Makkeh BePatish. So the Aruch HaShulchan's variant of the svara, I understand and hear a little bit more easily than the Meiri, but either way, these are the twin svaras that are floating around.
Meiri is not saying that it's not a malach in the other case. In the other case, if you're finishing off the writing of the book, you're still doing a malach, you're doing just a different malach. It's a malach of kotek. So whatever you could say, I'm not sure I agree with the fact that it's a kal v'chomer. It's just saying it's a different malacha.
It's a very important point you're making. For those in here, Adam is saying, the Meiri isn't saying it's not a malacha, the Meiri is saying it's a different malacha. For example, when you're writing the book, the first letters you're writing are the malacha of Kosiv, not the malacha of Makkeh BePatish. The problem with that is that the stress in the Meiri doesn't seem to be because it's another malacha. He seems to say it's a general rule that it's not Makkeh BePatish unless it's already completed. And therefore, conceivably in the Meiri, we could think of scenarios where it is no other malacha, and nonetheless it's not Makkeh BePatish because it's still making of the object, not the completion of the object. And indeed, I have two examples of that. Number one is if you hold ein binyan b'kelim, that is not boina in a keli, then it wouldn't be another malacha, but the completion would be Makkeh BePatish. And number two, maybe it would be Rashi's example, and the Meiri's example, the Mishnah's example of chatzivas ha'even, of hewing a stone. The earliest stages of hewing the stone, where you're hacking, and I'm not much of a quarrier, but whatever the term is, when you are quarrying the stone from the mountain, I don't know what malacha that is, other than the final separation of the mountain, which is Makkeh BePatish. And then he says, no, even that's not Makkeh BePatish because it's not yet completed. It's only once it's completely hewed from the mountain and I'm now pushing it away from the mountain, it's malacha. So what stops, I mean, there's many reasons why on Shabbos I shouldn't quarry over to the chol, and it's not in the spiritual Shabbos, it's it's an extra work. And there's all sorts of reasons why I shouldn't do it. But malacha wise, which malacha is hewing a stone from a mountain? If it's not Makkeh BePatish, I don't know what malacha it is. Maybe it could be this. To be honest, I haven't learned Perek Kabona properly. We're now learning our Perek. We just looked at the sugya of Perek Kabona to because it was so interlinked into what we're learning. But as far as I can see, I'm not aware of a malacha here other than the malacha of Makkeh BePatish. So according to the Meiri, I'm left with this question on the Meiri. The Meiri says that completing is a malacha once you already have something, but not even completing. He says when I don't yet have it and I do the completion, that's not Makkeh BePatish. It's when it's complete and I'm just removing a problem, I'm separating it, throwing off the mountain or trimming the threads. That's when it's the malacha of Makkeh BePatish. It's a little bit difficult to understand that completion of an object is not choshev enough to make it a malacha, but once it is complete and I'm just perfecting it, that is the malacha. It's almost counter to the svara of the other Rishonim, who seem to learn that the very chashivas of the malacha. Let's go with Rashi. Rashi doesn't hold like the Rambam. Rashi doesn't hint anywhere that the av malacha of Makkeh BePatish is any any craftsman-like action, significant action in an object. And Rashi seems to say the malacha is the Gemara malacha. That's how Rashi understands. So the svara around that seems to be because I'm completing something, that seems to be the malacha. Rashi doesn't say like the Meiri on the Aruch HaShulchan. Rashi says that even where the beginning and the end come together, and I'm making the object, that's the malacha of Gemara malacha. And I understand the intuition of Rashi well. Making something new is a malacha, even if it's not any other malacha. It's not oif, it's not kosef, it's no other malacha. But creating something yesh me'ayin, and something from nothing, creating a new object, a new functionality, a new keli, that is a malacha. So maybe no, that's not Makkeh BePatish because it's not yet finished. It's only once it's finished and I do something extra afterwards, that's the chashivas of the malacha. I don't quite understand the svara behind the Meiri. The Aruch HaShulchan I hear a bit better. The Aruch HaShulchan says the action of Makkeh BePatish is where there's a specific ending act. That's what imbues it with a chashivas, a specific completion act, not where it's just doing more and more and more of the same. But the Meiri's way of saying Sorah, I don't completely hear. Be that as it may, those were the sorts of highlights that we brought out from the Aruch HaShulchan, the Meiri, and the Rambam. And as I've already started saying, Rashi doesn't agree with any of these points. Rashi doesn't indicate anywhere that Ma'aseh Uman is the malacha, Gemara malacha is the malacha. Rashi doesn't indicate anywhere that he holds of this chiluk, that it has to be different to the asiyah. And on the contrary, I think we brought several rayas that Rashi holds that even if the asiyah and the Gemara malacha come together, that would be the malacha. One raya I brought just for the sake of simplicity is the case of the glass blower who blows a utensil. The run specifies for other reasons to do with binyan b'kenim, which we're not going to go into, but some of the Rishonim learn that this is, you already have the vacuum, the hole created inside the glass. You started with a ball of glass, you blow into it and you create a vacuum, an empty space inside it, and not vacuum, a volume inside it, air space inside it, and then you continue to blow till it's formed in the right way. So the other Rishonim say that you've already created the kli, and the Makkeh BePatish is the blow which forms it into the shape of utensil that you want it to be. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi seems to say the whole process would be Makkeh BePatish, because Rashi holds ein binyan b'kenim, incidentally. He says the whole process is Makkeh BePatish because even where from the start, the first blow that you do, if that's the last blow and you've created the hole inside, that would be enough. That's just one example of a few Rashis that we brought last Siman, where we see that Rashi doesn't hold of any of these subtleties of the distinction. Sorry, yes, you want to answer?
The Rambam talks about the melachot of the Oman. Is that as a inherent definition to Makkeh BePatish, that Makkeh BePatish has to be that, or is that like just a category of Torah of Makkeh BePatish? Just how you can have Gemara melachot, we see clearly that Rambam says Gemara melachot is like a Torah. Is the melachot of Oman, is that another category of Torah, or is that inherent in the Makkeh BePatish, in the other melachot?
It may be the specific example of the Rofer and the Melechus Uman that he speaks about there, it is a good question. But what you see in the Rambam is that the essence of Makkeh BePatish is not Gemara Melacha. So what is Makkeh BePatish? The Rambam says the opposite. He says several times in the Peish Mishnayos, he says Makkeh BePatish v'afilu Gemara Melacha, Kederech She'osin U'Rakayim, etc. And then and he translates that into the Gemara. Kol midi to isbei Gemara Melacha chayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish. He translates to mean that the chiddush is that any Gemara Melacha is also Makkeh BePatish as a tolda, but that's not the essence of Makkeh BePatish. And similarly, in Perek Yud Halacha Tzayin, Makkeh BePatish hakol achas chayiv v'chol oisad davar shu Gemara Melacha as they told us Makkeh BePatish. So it's clear in the Rambam that Gemara Melacha is a tolda of Makkeh BePatish. So what is Makkeh BePatish? So the Av Melacha is some sort of precise blow, and it's the precision of the blow, the Makkeh BePatish, which makes it into the Av Melacha. So now we learn as a tolda from that any other precise melacha is also a tolda Makkeh BePatish, and certain types of precise melachas would be the Av itself. I'm not sure exactly where the boundary would lie, but we see in the Rambam is if someone asks you what is the essence of the melacha of Makkeh BePatish, before I learned the sugya, we would have all said Gemara Melacha. Makkeh BePatish is a way of saying Gemara Melacha, says the Rambam. It's not a way of saying Gemara Melacha. Gemara Melacha is a tolda. Makkeh BePatish is Makkeh BePatish. A precise, crafted hammer blow is the Av Melacha, and we would extend that to other precise blows, and then other precise actions which are less similar to that would end up as toldas of that Av. And Zdeni and Rashi, we left with a bit of a puzzle in Rashi. Rashi gives two scenarios of the Av Melacha of Makkeh BePatish. The first scenario is the scenario he gives in the Mishnah in Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, where the melachas are listed. And Rashi says, Makkeh BePatish Yugmar Kol Melacha, Shkein and Makkeh Bekornus Al Asavin, Lachliko, the craftsman bangs on the anvil, the anvil to smooth it. So Rashi there says that's the Av Melacha. And in Haboinah, Rashi says the Av Melacha is the smashing or the quarrying of the stone from the rock. So after you hew, he says you first hew round it, and then you give one smash, and that sort of breaks it off the mountain, and that's the melacha of Makkeh BePatish. So where Rashi gets from that they're both of us is not entirely clear to me. Maybe one is an Av in the Mishkan and one is an Av in human functioning. That's what we suggested, but it's not entirely clear where Rashi gets that. There's two examples of the Av Melacha. A couple of you, by the way, asked that Rashi's pshat in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah, in Ein Gimel Amud Aleph of Makkeh BePatish, seems to be how Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel on the Mishnah as a variant opinion in Haboinah gives the example of Makkeh BePatish. So if you look at the Mishnah, because based on the base, after it talks about Makkeh BePatish, then we have a chiddush of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, also one who hits the corners on the hammer on the anvil is chayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish. Now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is a minority opinion. It's not clear that the Tanna Kama agrees with it, unless perhaps we go to Chayin, and similarly maybe Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is clarifying, not arguing. And secondly, he seems to say this is even this is Makkeh BePatish because it's also a masakin melacha. Now Rashi on our Mishnah in Ein Gimel didn't think that hitting with a hammer blow on an anvil is an even or a minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. He seemed to say this is the classic example of Makkeh BePatish. It's a good question. I know the answer. The Ron asked the question, and I printed it in the source sheet that I gave out at the beginning of the sugya. I hope I printed it in the source sheet. I meant to print it in the source sheet. Yes, source 9. Source 9 on page 3 in the source sheets. Is it printed in? Yeah, it's there. Yeah. So the Ron asked the question of Rashi, and as of now, I don't know the answer. Maybe Rashi learned Chayin in the Mishnah. In which case he learned that Rabbi Shimon, there's two Gesayos in our Mishnah, in brackets. Maybe Rashi understood that it's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is not saying anything controversial, he's just clarifying, but nonetheless, there's much that remains difficult in Shittas Rashi, but I think this is a fair summary of where we were up to in the Sugya and the different opinions around it. Now, with that introduction said, there is another way of looking at this whole issue as to the parameters of Makkeh BePatish. I want to emphasize that the svara of the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan, when they say that the manufacturing of something isn't Makkeh BePatish, it's only the completion is Makkeh BePatish, is not because the earlier stages of another melacha. And this was a part of our conversation that I just now had with Adam. It's not because they're another melacha. The point they're making isn't since this is another melacha, therefore it can't be Makkeh BePatish. They're just saying it doesn't fit within the definition of Makkeh BePatish, and conceivably, even if it is no other melacha, it nonetheless wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish. There is an independent discussion about whether something can be two melachos at the same time. Can it be Makkeh BePatish plus something else? This is a separate svara. The Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan were interested in the definition of Makkeh BePatish, and their point was that Makkeh BePatish isn't manufacturing, it's completing. And therefore they said that the earlier stage is not. What are the earlier stages? Are they a malacha or not malacha? Not interested in this. Is this act of completion also another malacha or not? Again, that's not what they're focused on. Could be they're not interested in that. They're talking about completion versus manufacture. We can now ask a new shaila, which is, can something be both Makkeh BePatish and something else? Can it be two malachas at the same time? So this is an important question. And it would be interesting and useful, perhaps, if it turns out that something couldn't be two malachas at the same time, because that would resolve the question that's rumbling around in the sugya, the Ran asked, the Meiri asked, and so on and so forth, which is, why aren't you always chayiv every time you complete a book? Why aren't you chayiv for kosif plus Makkeh BePatish every time you stop weaving? Why aren't you chayiv because of orig and Makkeh BePatish every time you bake a bread? Why aren't you chayiv because of ofer and Makkeh BePatish? In all these cases, why aren't you chayiv shkayim for these malachas? Now, the Aruch HaShulchan and the Meiri came up with their own answers. Rashi doesn't agree with these answers. If we could demonstrate that it can't be two malachas, then we would answer the question. Because by definition, if it's ofer, it's not Makkeh BePatish. By definition, if it's kosef, it's not Makkeh BePatish. By definition, if it's oreg, it's not Makkeh BePatish. That would resolve all these dilemmas. If this answer isn't correct, then we would have to find other answers. We'd have to nitpick and work out maybe there's some other reason why oreg isn't Makkeh BePatish, why ofer is not Makkeh BePatish, or we'd bite the bullets. We'd say, Enochanami, it's two malachas, and that's not a problem. And when the Gemara says that you're chayiv for kosef oreg, it's because it's that. But Enochanami, if it was also the completion, then it would also be Makkeh BePatish. So we're not in disaster territory if it turns out that there's two malachas. It's just the next point in my list of things that I wanted to clarify in the sugya is this question, because the Meiri and the Ran have led us naturally to contemplate this. So what we need to do, just as our homework, is we need to look at evidence from other sugyas. Can one thing be two malachas? We need to look for evidence from Rashi. Does Rashi give us any indicators about his view around this? And we need to understand the svara of why would it be that something can't be two malachas at the same time, if indeed that's the case. So that's going to be our agenda for the time remaining today, and probably part of next year also. Yes?
Doesn't the Meiri already hint at the last line of Meiri?
Question was, doesn't the Meiri already hint to that from the last line of the Meiri? Can you spell out what you mean by that?
So he says, She'im lokem, nothing. It's almost like he's using it as a backup. But the idea that if my principle, that my whole argument comes because if that wasn't the case, this absurd example of you doing considering the time twice doesn't make sense. It's almost like Meiri has that to start with.
Okay, so I'm going to, just for the purpose of those online, repeat your question, but not as a question, but as a statement, which is, I agree with you. The Meiri in the last line, that's why what I meant to hint at when I said that the Meiri and the Ran already open up this possibility of why wouldn't everything be two malachas. So what I'm sort of doing is paraphrasing what the Meiri says. The statement is a question. The Meiri sort of asks, why wouldn't everything be two malachas? And he says, because my theory that something, if it's manufacturing, isn't Makkeh BePatish, answers that question. So you're correct. The Meiri is bothered by this idea that every baking or every weaving should also be Makkeh BePatish, and he's found a satisfactory answer to that question. But we can posit a different answer, which is that by definition, if something is another melacha, then it can't be Makkeh BePatish.
Was it not that the Meiri seems that idea to be so absurd?
Yeah, no, the Meiri does consider it absurd. Yeah, the Meiri says otherwise there's something lacking in every sugya. Every time we say, if you bake a bread, you chayiv ofer, we should have said ofer, and when you finish, you chayiv Makkeh BePatish. If you weave a garment, you chayiv oreg, you should have said oreg and Makkeh BePatish. Nonetheless, we can question this absurd, what the Meiri finds absurd, we can say isn't absurd. And when you learn Masechet Shabbat, you have to learn lots of sugyas, and it could well turn out that you're chayiv shtayim for doing for doing one activity. If you throw the shuttle that's used in weaving, the shuttle that goes backwards and forwards between the threads, if you position your loom over the border between a Rosh Hashanah and a Rosh Hashanah Yochid, or it's a loom in a Rosh Hashanah and it's a very long loom which is 4 amos long, then maybe you'll be chayiv for carrying on Shabbos at the same time as you're like. Of course, right, with human ingenuity, we can dream up all sorts of scenarios where you're chayiv shtayim for one act, and no problem with that. Gemara discusses if you shoot an arrow on Shabbos, and you're chayiv both for hotzah and for murder, right? So we can always dream up. The Meiri, to be fair, the Meiri is bothered by this because he probably says it's intrinsic. Every oreig would also be a Makkeh BePatish. Every kosev would also be a Makkeh BePatish. Okay, but we can bite the bullet and say anachnami, you would be chayiv shtayim. And without giving away the punchline, I think we're going to have to come on to that answer. I think we are going to find Rishonim who don't agree with our Shulchan, don't agree with the Meiri, and don't agree with our assumption or our positive suggestion that something can't be both Makkeh BePatish and another melacha. And I'll tell you which Rishon I think that's going to be. I think that's going to be Rashi. I think Rashi is not, in the same way as Rashi hasn't gone with any of the Aruch HaShulchan and hasn't gone with the Meiri. I think the Rashi is not going to go with this theory either. But we're a long way off that. So for now, our homework is, our task ahead of us is to explore the possibility that something can't be 2 melachos at once, to consider other sugyas and rayas we can bring, to consider rayas from Rashi as to what Rashi holds about that, and to try and understand the lomdus of this suggestion. What would be the story around the suggestion? Sorry, Adam, I think you wanted to ask something.
I just wanted to ask, why can't you say at the end of the Meiri that there's a difference between a malacha which has a one activity malacha, like Ketzer and a Chayrish, to malacha, and in those situations you can't be chayav Makkeh BePatish, to the malachas like Ketzer and Oreig, which will lead to a conclusion where you could be chayav Makkeh BePatish.
I think you're correct. You know what? To clarify your question, because I have a chakir in what you mean.
Some malachas, one activity is the malacha. There's the chilata the sefer kam ka'achat.
Yes.
But other malachas, the chilata the sefer doesn't come ka'achat. It comes in a staged basis. Yes, like when you stop writing, your first letter you haven't done a malacha. Then okay, maybe you'll do a malacha. You've done a second, but if you stop it, you could do a letter at the end, which could be so there could be a malacha where a sefer could be a Makkeh BePatish.
Okay, I'm not going to repeat Adam's question. I'll just try and clarify it because I want to explain the point. There are malachas like Ketzer and Chayrish and so on, where the concept of Makkeh BePatish isn't easily apparent at all. I mean, a field that's ploughed it's good that it's ploughed, or a field that's sown, it's good that it's sown, but it's not easy to see that there's a sort of Makkeh BePatish or a completion of a functionality, particularly get there. That is correct. It's equally true that with Oreig and Kosev, I write and I write and I write till the book is finished, and at that point it's finished. It's a Makkeh BePatish of sorts. The discussion that the Meiri is interested, therefore, is only in those cases, the Kosev and the Oreig type scenarios. Now we can put forward 3 reasons why, when you finish the kosev, you're not chayav for Makkeh BePatish. Reason number 1 is what the Meiri says, because it's just it's not adding something to an already completed entity; it's just finishing the entity. Reason number 2 is what the Aruch HaShulchan said, because there's no unique finishing act; it's just continuing to do what I do till it's finished. We've now put forward reason number 3, which is because it's another malacha, and therefore it can't be Makkeh BePatish. That's another way of summarizing our discussion, which is, can we posit a 3rd reason why writing a last letter wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish, not because it's not a specific completion act, like the Aruch HaShulchan says, not because it's not already finished and I'm adding something to a finished thing, like the Meiri says, but because it's another melacha, and by definition, if it's another melacha, it can't be kosev. Now, this suggestion that something can't be Makkeh BePatish and another melacha at the same time has an intuitive appeal to it. And I want to flesh that out because we're going to need to think about this in order to consider the rayas that we have from other sugyas. And I will only bring, there are many rayas around this. I'm only going to bring rayas from sugyas we've already learned. So actually, maybe in this show, I'm not going to bring the rayas, and I'm going to do that as a bit of homework, so everyone can do some chazorah. From the sugyas, Rabbi Zobin, that we've learned already, I think there's a couple of interesting rayas to this shaila. But the intuitive appeal to the appeal to intuition in this svara is that there's something very attractive about arguing that if it's another melacha, it can't be Makkeh BePatish. Because if the chashivas of Makkeh BePatish is that I'm completing something, I'm manufacturing something, then we can understand how it's subsumed in another melacha when the other melacha is present. So kosev isn't the argument would go that if I'm chayav for kosev because it's another melacha, it's not Makkeh BePatish. Not because I haven't completed something like the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan Svara. Of course I've completed a book. It's fantastic that I completed a book. But there's a more specific name for what the nature of this completion is. It's completion of a writing sequence. It's kosev. That's what kosev is. When I finish baking a bread, of course I've manufactured something. Of course there's been a Makkeh BePatish of sorts here. I've completed the bread. But there's a more specific label. It's not just a completion of any old thing. It's a completion of it's a baked bread. Well, that is the melacha of ofer. So the intuition here is that Makkeh BePatish is like a general term, a catch-all term for completion of anything, but there are certain completions which have a more specific label to them, and that's what the other melachos are. Kosev is a more specific type of doing. A fia is a more specific type of doing. A riga, weaving, is a more specific type of doing, and therefore it supersedes the possibility of Makkeh BePatish because it is more specific. It's a more specific type completion. This is the appeal to intuition, which I make. It's not a raya. You could argue either way, but this is what leads to I'm beginning to think about this sort of svara, and therefore it directs us to explore whether it turns out that the sugyas and Rashi and the Rishonim demonstrate truth to this svara or not. But that's the appeal to intuition that's going on over here. I think therefore I'll stop here for today rather than bringing any rayas. And in Yetz Hashem on Tuesday, one of the Gemaras around it, one of the potential rayas, perhaps wrong, perhaps right. I'm not seeking for you to find definitive rayas. I'd just be interested in Tuesday if you could share with me any sources you think that we've learned that could be indicators around this, even whether good indicators or not. One Gemara we learned seems to be very clear eye around this. One Gemara we didn't learn, but I referenced in the share, also seems to be a eye around this. So just for Tuesday, I'd be interested if people have any suggestions about evidence either way from sources that we've learned, even if you think it's not definitive, and then we'll try and see where the evidence points. But for today, I'll stop. And thank you so much to all of you for joining, as always.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Yerushalmi is relevant, though I put that on the source sheet, but yeah, I'm happy to hear what people think about that too. Yeah.